Hello, and welcome to our Lunar Reflections podcast, where we'll be joining with the moon while Jupiter is in Cancer. Each month, we'll release an episode to coincide with the new moon, but today is our very first special episode on eclipse season with guest astrologer SJ Anderson. I'm Tara, an astrologer from the UK.
I'm Helen, an astrologer from Scotland in the UK.
It's really great to have you here today, SJ. Do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Yes, I'm an astrologer from Texas, born in Austin, and currently living in Tirana, Albania. And I've been an astrologer for a few years now and love astrology. Grateful to be engaging with astrological practice and, other astrologers in the world and to have a place today to share astrology with you two and with the audience. So thank you for having me and very grateful. Again, it's a gift to just be able to talk about this. And so I feel really happy about it.
No, I do too. And for those listening, SJ and I connected a few years ago on Astro Twitter and have stayed in touch since. And I'm really happy to have you on today. And the reason is we're coming up to eclipse season. We're recording today on the 31st of August. So the first eclipse is in a week's time. So it'd be great just to hear a little bit about how you look at the nodes, maybe with like a basic explanation of eclipses.
For sure. I mean, I think the stand-in phrase that is most commonly thrown around or passed around in the astrology world is fate. You'll hear people say nodes of fate. And so I like that as a doorway into the conversation because fate means something. I mean, I think it's worth pausing and really asking ourselves, what does that as a concept imply? For me, some of the ideas about that include fate is what we didn't know that becomes true. And so I like an edge of fate that it's about something we can't see, but that we become unexpectedly. Often that's how fate is most potently experienced, because it's an interruption of what we thought may have been the case. And so, because if it's normal and you already knew it and that you knew how something was going to go, it's not, I don't think fate is as much of an applicable term. That would just be kind of my life or what I assume to be true. Fate often has this kind of intervention layer. We can come back to that, but I think when you're talking about eclipses and eclipse season and the astronomical event of eclipses and the astrological meaning behind them and the timing piece of when they arrive, what I think we're really saying is, hey, there may be emergences of where our lives kind of should be going or our truer path that going into an eclipse moment, we don't have as much clarity about what the eclipses show us or reveal to us. And so that's one, the idea of fate showing itself and some of that being unexpected. But two, I think there is a sense of acceleration that astrologers often assign to eclipses and the way we delineate what eclipses are, meaning that sometimes it can just feel out of control, that we don't really have as much of an ability to form or manage life, that we have to kind of release into something that is forcing itself upon us and maybe moving a little bit faster. And so those two things, I think, are how I think about eclipses at some level. Let me just say this about the astronomy. We had talked about this a little bit before here, but what eclipses are astronomically is it's the sun and the moon. Well, first of all, they're new moons or full moons, always. They have to be in alignment with the sun, moon, and earth, or what we call a syzygy between the sun, moon, and earth. And so eclipses are like any other new moon or full moon in one sense, because there you have that alignment with the sun, moon, and earth. How eclipses are different is that these alignments of the sun and moon and earth occur close to what we call the lunar nodes. And just put it very simply, people are going to want to go take your Astronomy for Astrologers course here after this if you're interested to go deeper. But basically, the sun moves in the sky against the celestial sphere 365 days to complete its circle around the celestial sphere, meaning that every day the sun is moving against the backdrop of the fixed stars, and the fixed stars behind it change throughout the year because it's just moving in its straight line path, which we call the ecliptic. The moon also has a path against the backdrop of the celestial sphere, but that path is not the same as the solar path. They're on different planes. And so half the time the moon is higher than the sun, or the moon's path is higher than the ecliptic. Half the time the moon's path is lower than the ecliptic. That's why sometimes you'll go out and the moon is very low on the horizon. Everybody's seen that. It's like, whoa, why is the moon so low? That's weird. It kind of feels tripped out, you know. That's when the moon is what we call at the south bending, or at its lowest point on its path. It's very much below the ecliptic. And so the lunar nodes are where the moon and its path are on the ecliptic. And that means that when there's a new moon, and people can Google this, type in lunar nodes and get a Google image search, and you'll see that what I'm talking about here. But when you have a new moon, when the lunar path is on the same plane as the solar path, it's only then that the light can be blocked. And during a solar eclipse, the moon comes in between the Earth and the sun, near or on the same plane, and the moon blocks out the sun's light as it comes to the Earth. So it's dark during the daytime if it's visible in where you are. And during a lunar eclipse, the moon is, of course, reflecting the sun's light, and the Earth gets in between the sun and the moon so that that reflection is blocked, and the moon gets this dark red, what they call blood moon. So the last thing to put those concepts together, this is just the last thing, and why the astronomy, in my view, is important, is that think if you're outside, you've been outside your whole life, you're working on your yard, you're planting your garden, and it's in the middle of the day, and all of a sudden it's nighttime in the middle of the day, and you knew nothing about this. You knew nothing about eclipses. That would be quite strange, different, unexpected. It would be an acceleration in the sense that you're like, this, what's happening? It could be fear-inducing. But at the same time, it is uh, attaching itself to that first part of fate that I mentioned, which is that it's showing you the true nature of your reality, because it exposes at least from one perspective, the construct that we're embedded in, meaning the mathematics behind the sun and moon. I mean, eclipses are what allow us to, using physics and cosmology, build a frame of the world, a construct of the reality. So in that sense, eclipses are fundamental to exposing the true nature of the reality from just the astronomical perspective. And that's why when you come to the astrological, we think about, okay, eclipses are happening in this area of my chart and hitting this planet in my chart. And so they're involved in this story in my astrology. And what they may do is expose the true nature through something that could be kind of weird, strange, maybe scary, and maybe unexpected. And there you go. That's how I think you get that matching of the astronomical experience with the astronomical experience with the astrological meaning set.
Wow, no, I think that's such a good explanation. And for those listening, you've been able to paint a real picture of how we experience eclipses here on this plane, but what's actually happening above. I've always been, and thank you for that. I've always been really interested in eclipses and nodes, and that time of the year always feels very thin. And I think it's interesting that we have these eclipses that are coinciding with the equinoxes as well, because that time is also very thin and it feels like it's kind of compounded. And when you were talking about this idea of release, it made me think of like Rudyard's, I love Daniel Rudyard's lunation cycle. And I had a quote pulled up that I was going to pull out at some point, but it seems pertinent to do it now. And it says every cycle is a story, a beginning, a growth, a fulfillment, and a release. And the lunation cycle is the prototype for all cycles of existence. And an eclipse reveals that we cannot cling to old forms if we are to move forward. And I think that kind of sums up what you've been explaining, that we can't kind of hide from what the eclipses are trying to teach us. That story is embedded in our natal promise, and it's going to kind of position itself how it will, and it's almost a kind of surrendering to it that I find. And I'm not sure if you've got any kind of thoughts around that.
Yeah, likewise, I think the weaving there that you did with, the astronomy and the astrological interpretation, I think is so profound. And one of the things that struck me about that, and you mentioned that there's these three bodies, these paths of the sun and moon come into collision from the perspective of Earth. So it's the sun, which is kind of spirit, the moon, which is soul, and the earth, which is matter, and the three come together. So it's not surprising that when an eclipse hits a point in a person's natal chart, thinking about it natally, that that's likely to be quite significant. And there's just another, maybe a more almost pedestrian point, but one that I find endless fascination with, which is that astronomically, the fact that the moon appears from Earth to be pretty much the same size as the sun is this incredible. I mean, there are other planets with moons that you don't necessarily get that effect, and yet in Earth you do. And in fact, the moon's distance from Earth has been changing over the very long term. So it's this era in which the moon appears to be exactly the same size as the sun from the perspective of Earth, which enables that incredible visual spectacle that people have been observing and rightly in awe of for thousands of years.
Yes, yes. Just to follow up there, I think this is a huge point about astrology. And I think another reason why eclipses are so fundamental to track is that we have planets in astrology, as you two know, but there's only two planets, astrological planets, that are giant disks of light in the sky. And we call them luminaries in the astrological system, and that's the sun and moon. And so that there's a certain type of astrology, and in the ancient world, you'll see this sometimes in how they write about the planets, but they call the sun and moon rulers of the whole. That's one phrase you'll see. I think that's Paulus Alexandrinus when he's talking about the Egyptian bounds or terms. The sun and moon don't have in Egypt a segment of degrees in each zodiac sign assigned to them because they're the whole. They don't need to be subdivided, is the idea. The sun in the ancient texts is the light of consciousness or the mind of the beingness or something. That's not the exact phrase, but and then the moon is the container, the materiality. Sometimes you see body is moon, spirit is sun, and the spirit is contained in a body. That's what a human being is. Like we have this bodily container of our awareness and our spirit. And so I think that's why they're rulers of the whole. They're like these fundamental components of life, the body and the mind, the spirit and the body. And the other thing about the sun and moon is that in terms of the domicile rulership scheme, they do not receive two signs. They actually get only one sign. And that's when it's most light in the northern hemisphere, or definitely with the summer solstice being the point where there's most light in the northern hemisphere. So let me just put it, I think there's something when you have these 2 points doing this dance with our astrological technique of like opposition and conjunction, the nature of what these bodies are and how they're distinct from everything else in the system, that alone is worth centering them and their conjunctions and oppositions, let alone the eclipses. I mean, the eclipses are a special version of that, but this is why we have like new moon and full moon videos, and why everybody's so obsessed about those in the astrological world. I think there's something, let me just cut this short and get to the heart of it. There's something very special about the sun and moon. And there was one other thing I was going to just say there that it's escaping me. I think, yes, I'm with you there, that there's a sense that you can do whole readings with just the sun and the moon and the rising. You see this, right, with contemporary astrology of like your big three. I don't think that is an error. I think there's a reason why people bring those points as the center points, because there's something uniquely special about how the sun and moon can tell us who we are and what we're about. And then finally, we have techniques like the lots, the lot of spirit and the lot of fortune, that are derived only based on the relationship between the sun and moon and the rising. And so I guess what I'm saying, a long way to say it, is that there's a special place in that in the astrological systems, and there always has been, with looking at the sun and the moon, independent of other factors in the chart. And the eclipses are another reason that we do that and how we do that.
Yeah, no, I think all of that makes perfect sense. And I'm glad that you picked up the lots, because I was thinking about how we calculate the lot and bring in like the sun and moon's relationship in relation to the ascendant. And it's another kind of snapshot. It's another anchor point in the lunation cycle. It's like a personal kind of echo. And I think once you start to layer all of those different techniques and ideas, you get a much fuller understanding of why the luminaries are so important, and why these eclipse seasons can be really good markers of where you're at in your own personal kind of story, whether you want to face that or not, which is why it can feel uncomfortable. We've talked about it kind of showing things up, illuminating, revealing. So yeah, really interesting. I think we should probably move on to the upcoming eclipses and talk a little bit about what we think this is kind of signifying. So we've got this first lunar eclipse in Pisces, 15 degrees, September 7th. 2 weeks later, we have the solar eclipse at Virgo, critical degree, 29 degrees, September 21st. So before we kind of look at the charts and see like what's going on in the cosmos, it'd be good to maybe think a little bit around the Virgo Pisces axes, because quite a lot of things that for me, I think, has been happening in those houses. And I was thinking about how Saturn is moving into back into Pisces, yes, tomorrow. And for me, I'm just like, Saturn really is here to say, look, I might have moved on, but that story hasn't finished yet. I'm here and you need to kind of pay attention. So it feels like whatever started for you in that house from March 2023, it's being revisited. It's not the end of that Saturn story. And I just think it's quite telling that it moves in just before we get that first kind of eclipse. So what do you guys think about like the Pisces Virgo axes? Do you have any placements there,
Go ahead.
Helen?
Yeah, sure. So for me, it's just in a whole sign houses framework. It's my third and ninth, and I don't have any planets in either sign. But what I do have, and I was just thinking of that when you were talking, Tara, about the lots and the significance of some of the key lots from the sun and moon. I have the lot of spirit in the early degrees of Virgo, which will be obviously picked up by one of the eclipses that we're going to discuss. But other than that, I don't have any. Do either of you?
I have Pisces with Mercury there in my chart, and I have the lot of fortune with Mercury in Pisces, and I have my prenatal syzygy or prenatal donation, depending on what term you want to use, in Virgo. So I always was like, I have nothing in Virgo or nothing in Earth, and then I actually have that prenatal full moon, and then I have yeah, so there you go. I was just I have Chiron and Taurus, so I do have some Earth, depending on how much you want to expand out. But
Hmm.
um, yeah, and I'd just say this is my sixth and 12th, and I've always felt a little bit disconnected from the 12th house, and my relationship to Virgo has it's changing as I've been working as an astrologer for a while, coming to kind of learn that better. But it's always been like a tougher sign for me to kind of feel into, and those 12th house transits through Virgo, I've often kind of wanted to avoid or run from that energy. So just to talk about Virgo for me, I mean, I wish I had like a rising in Virgo or a sun or a moon. I might be a better equipped to address it. But
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I've only got my Venus in Virgo, and this is the second and eighth house for me. And it's interesting what you said around like there's some places in your chart that you're just like they kind of either blind spots or you're just not ready to kind of, and it feels similar to me for Virgo. Like I've got a Venus altar now because I know my Venus is in fall and I am understanding more around Virgo. But what's interesting is my progressed sun is at 29 degrees. So I've been a progressed Virgo sun since I was 14, and next year I'm going to move into Libra. So it feels like this last year is going to really be about that culmination of Virgo energy. And I think it's not lost on me that we're having these eclipses there as well. But when I think about the Virgo Pisces kind of axes, I think about discernment versus dreaming, but also tangible versus intangible and kind of bringing those things together. Like it, I know we talk about the acts of service, but it goes kind of deeper than that. And it's interesting when we look at the sister signs or the duality of the signs, where there is complete and utter overlap, and then you have this kind of opposition, and they come at it very different ways of being. You've got Jupiter, which expands out, ruling Pisces, and then you've got Mercury, which zooms in for Virgo. And actually they're both very complementary, but it means that Virgo can struggle to see the bigger picture sometimes, and sometimes Pisces just can't gather all the details together. But there's this thing around human flaws and perfection as well that I pick up on this axis, and definitely what I'm learning more is this concept of surrender and how both Virgo and Pisces has that humility to just surrender completely.
I Yeah, it's amazing. An axis is always great to explore. One thing to note is that when signs are opposing each other, they're the same modality, they're the same gender, if we want to use a gendered concept, or we can say same polarity to use the Robert Hand concept from his book Horoscope Symbols. And they are different elements. So the three main ways that we categorize zodiac signs, and these signs in opposition will be very like each other. They'll have this great affinity, except for this one elemental difference. And so that's one way in. I mean, I think I've seen that when signs are on the same axis opposite each other, there's a lot of commonality and a lot of overlap. I think the mutability is something I would highlight here, that these are signs of change.
Mhm.
And they're signs of having to grapple with change and process change and be with a changing world, and how difficult that can be and how that can require paying a lot of attention. Virgo, you have to really, if things are shifting out from what they were and becoming something else, but they're not quite what they will be yet, you kind of need to, okay, where's my bag? And if you've been traveling in an airport, you've got to pay attention to where your stuff is, and you got to have your paperwork ready to go and accessible, and you don't want to lose your ticket, and you want to make sure you're following all the rules with baggage sizes, and all of this Virgoan necessity during moments of change. And often and then it's material. So you're talking about the earth element, which is the material expression, the tangibility, things you can touch, as you mentioned there, Tara. And I think that metaphor of like baggage in an airport is very much about our material objects and making sure that those are okay. I think there's a component of it. And I'm going to go, I won't go too long, but I like this topic and I can tend to maybe run on with it. Let me just lay a few more things out here. Triplicity is one of my favorite astrological concepts, rulership by triplicity. When I examine elements, something I find essential. And Virgo is an interesting sign because there is an exaltation and a domicile lord that's the same planet, Mercury. So you don't have any other planets if you were to stop there in terms of connecting planets by rulership to the sign. But when you bring triplicity in, you get two other planets, and you get the moon and Venus. And I think the moon is really important when you talk about all earth signs. Clearly, it rules Taurus by exaltation, so we know that. But the moon is our bodies. So we're again back to, I think, with Virgo, like paying attention to particularities of the physical containers so that we are, protected and safe. And sometimes you see clean or medical is sometimes assigned to Virgo in a lot of modern traditions. And that's because it's a bodily lunar component with Virgo. Mercury's medical. So you get like medical on the body. And so, okay, I'm going to stop there and just say, I think with Pisces, that's where you get this opposition and I think we're back to like sun and moon, because if the moon is the body, what does the body house? It's the spirit. And then therefore Pisces becomes this like intangible or disembodied side of this same dance of change. Jupiter's often disembodied. I mean, it's kind of like the spirit reaching for what can be, hope for the future that's not real. I mean, that's very Jupiterian. And so for me, Pisces is about, yeah, disembodied approaches to change and how we have aspiration and we have, love, like Pisces, Venus ruling Pisces by exaltation. There is hope and desire and all of these kind of inner states that are very kind of grandeur that sometimes are very personal and you can't even articulate the emotional inner states. You just don't, someone says, why are you doing it? I just don't know. I'm compelled. I feel just a strong desire for something, and it's inexplicable at times. And that's how I think they can both oppose each other, because if you're too hopeful and too in your own inner trip, then you lose sense of the body. And I'll say this here because I was just thinking about it, but addiction can be highly relevant with this axis. If you are too in a disembodied state of pleasure, that might be the Piscean, then you're out of balance with taking care of the bodily needs. And if you're too locked into the bodily component, then you lose an ability to like feel states of longing or spiritual connection, which addiction is very much related to. But it's like that's like where it gets out of balance. Any axis I like to think about as like a seesaw, and you get out of balance on one, you need the other, and so that's kind of the dance. It's like let me just say this and I'll stop. But for this eclipse season, I really encourage people, pay attention. Like, do you have stuff in your fridge? Do you have water? I was just talking about this in a video I released, is like, do you have like rice and beans? Just getting your basics settled in your house. That's going to help you if the eclipse season wildness comes here and it's really out of control, or you're having real internal experiences that are like a thin veil, as you mentioned, Tara. The Virgo side, we may be able to lock in here, especially with Mercury there from the 2nd of September to the 17th, I think it is. We have power to kind of take care of our tangible material as like an anchor here for at least a lot of this eclipse season. And anyhow, I know that's a lot there, but I just, I have a lot of thoughts about this stuff. Yes, it's really fascinating and interesting.
I think some of that is what I was thinking of when I was reflecting on myself around immutability. I think definitely there's that commonality, and I think of, Sagittarius and Gemini as being a bit more similar when it comes to Mercury versus, opposing Jupiter's sign, maybe superficially so. But that Earth versus water contrast, and I think I see a sort of search for meaning and a search for understanding in both signs. Like in Virgo, it's often a categorization. It's like let's break things down. It's almost a left-brained kind of a let's reduce things to its component parts and see how they work together. Label this, label that, and sort of that will help us to understand things and help us to be in control. Whereas when it comes to Pisces, there's like a creative imagination way of trying to understand things that is like on the other side of that polarity. But the two can be really complementary when they're integrated, when they work together in terms of, trying to understand the world and trying to search for meaning.
I think both of you have really touched upon some really deep and thoughtful, insightful kind of aspects of the duality. And I agree, SJ, I could talk about duality for a long time. It's something that you can kind of overlook, but actually you can't really analyze a sign without looking at its opposition, because that shows you a lot about that sign as well. And I love what you said around the practical ways. We just did a really big shop on Saturday, and well, I'm hoping that will last us through eclipse season. It's almost like you have to hunker down. It's like time to hibernate and get all your kind of resources, because we just don't, you think you know what's going to come up in these eclipses, but you're never quite sure. And especially on a mental and emotional level, like having the capacity to go out and make sure that you've got your fridge stocked and all of the basics, I think is really important. So a really good tip there. Shall we have a look at the charts and see what's going on? Because you spoke about Mercury, and I do think it moving in on the 2nd will give some strength to it. So that first eclipse is at 15-degree Pisces. So yes, we've been talking about Pisces and Virgo, but it does pull in, like you've said, Helen, Gemini and Sagittarius, that whole axis. So if you have like placements around 15 degrees, this eclipse might feel more intense. Helen, do you want to talk a little bit about the chart?
Sure. So this is I think it's a total lunar eclipse on the 7th of September, and I'm looking at it from a kind of Glasgow location, so it may subtly vary, but in this location, the moon is full in Pisces, or in, I think, as you said, Tara, 15 degrees, and Mercury is about 5 degrees out, so it's domiciled in exaltation with the sun, and 5 degrees apart. And at that point, Saturn's also retrograded back into Pisces, which will be definitely influencing the energy there, I think. And the ruler of the moon is exalted in Cancer, but it's also given a trine to the moon as well. So that was one of the things that jumped out as kind of relatively supportive in this chart.
Yeah, I picked up on that trine and was like, okay, that's something really nice and supportive. I've really enjoyed the mutual receptions between both the Sagittarius and Pisces moons. I think that's been a nice reprieve from when Saturn was kind of co-present with the Pisces moons, especially. You've picked up on both Saturn and Mercury. I think it's really interesting that it's moving in before, almost to say, like, hi, we're here, we're a part of this story too. And it'd be interesting to just think about since the nodes moved January 11th, like what's been kind of going on for you on a personal level, for those listening, like where your Virgo and Pisces houses are. It's interesting, there's like a minor grand trine also with, you've got Pluto at Aquarius, 1 degree, you've got that Uranus. Gemini, we've spoken before, Helen, about these outers just showing up everywhere in these charts. And then you've got that Pisces, newly 29-degree Saturn. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what this feels like in practice, because in theory, we know that these lunar eclipses are about culminations, endings, release, dissolving. And when we think about Virgo and Pisces energy, what is it that we need to surrender? Like, what do we need to let go of? What spiritual clarity will we get through some of this chaos? I don't know, SJ, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're wise. I mean, my thought here was just Jupiter and Cancer. I feel like this is the moment that we might be ready. Another one, we had that moment in June with the new moon next to Jupiter and Cancer, but I feel like this is another moment where it's going to take center stage, and we're going to need it. We're going to need to go
Mhm.
deep with Jupiter and Cancer to I think maximally engage this eclipse moment. I think, of course, it's just based on Pisces. What is the domicile lord of Pisces? Well, it's Jupiter. And so right away, you need to go to Jupiter, but as you two point out, it's in a close aspect as well. And so to me, in one sense, if we just had a whole conversation on Jupiter and Cancer, that would be great preparation for this eclipse. And of course, we're going to talk about other factors, but I mean that it's so potent here and so directly linked to the story that, again, it would prepare us a lot of the way. And just succinctly, I mean, home, nurturance, who are you responsible to, who do you love, and how do you nurture them? And there you go. Cancer also can imply, similarly to Pisces, big picture questions of like, what is the collective home and the collective human family? And Jupiter is spirituality, it's truth and wisdom. So, what is the wisdom of this realm? And why are we here? And there's a lot of nodal conversation that can be brought back into the idea of Cancer and the sign of Cancer. And it makes sense because the nodes are the lunar nodes, and Cancer is the sign of the moon. The evolutionary schools, they're big on the lunar nodes. They're big on Neptune and Pluto because they use modern rulerships, but Neptune rules Pisces and Pluto rules Scorpio, and then the lunar nodes are where they give to Cancer. So it's all about the water element in the evolutionary school, just philosophically. Like that's the starting point for their systems. But anyhow, I just think the truth of being the bigger truths of existence are in play here. And that sounds, I can't even, that doesn't do it justice what's in play here. I can't put words to attach to really what's happening here. It's so profoundly, inexplicable reality, the mystery of life, the mystery of being. And Pisces is a mute sign, Cancer is a mute sign. There's something here where I think we don't really even need language right now to best ride this moment. This September, I think Saturn back in Pisces for 5 months. A lot of the fall is going to be this. There's
Mhm.
three grand water trines this fall, including Jupiter and Saturn now in the water axis together. It'll be Mars, it'll be the Sun, I think it'll be Mercury, Venus will be there. There's a bunch of water element theme that this moment kind of announces its arrival quite loud. And so my advice to people is, yeah, how do you process emotions? How do you get in touch with your emotional body? How do you work with energy that is not intellectual energy? And I think the mercurial side of it is maybe more, as you were saying, Helen, like sometimes we need to check in with our outer physical space to make sure we're protected and safe for these inner journeys. And I think that's more of the Virgo version of Mercury rather than the air element side, which might be we're writing it down and we're communicating about it. I think it's going to be less about that, I think, right now. So, yeah, I mean, what else can I say? I was going to say this earlier, just quickly. There can be wonderful things with eclipses. I've seen it over and over and over again. And yes, they're quite unexpected. I like what you said there, Tara. We don't really know. And that's the beauty of life. We don't even have no idea what may happen here October 1st, where we'll be, the kind of new emergences that are going to show themselves. But I just encourage people to hold out for really positive things happening in your life too. And I say that in general, that's true, I think, most of the time or all the time. But to have Jupiter trine here and it's exalted, this is a very supportive, so-called positive, so-called energy. So hold out for that, everyone. This could be awesome. You could have some real breakthroughs here.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. In terms of Jupiter in its exaltation, really provides that support. And I think even despite how it might feel at the time, most of the time it's for your the better and for the good, and you kind of only grow through those things. So, and you can't help but grow when you have Jupiter involved. And it's interesting, I think, having all of that water energy, but then having the groundedness of the Sun in Virgo and Mercury in its exaltation. It will be really nice to have that kind of grounding that we probably will need to kind of hold on to. And I guess that kind of moves us into the solar eclipse that happens 2 weeks later. And I think it's really interesting because we obviously had the new moon recently in Virgo at 0 degrees. And we spoke about it, didn't we, Helen, around the fact that these two new moons are not in isolation, the fact that it's at the anaretic degrees of either side of the sign. There's something kind of full circle with that. Obviously, it's a kind of slightly different chart in that it's not no longer ruled by Mercury and Virgo. Mercury would have moved on into Libra by that point, but there will still be a sextile between Jupiter and the Moon, which will be quite supportive again.
Yeah. Yeah, that's quite lovely. And also just coming back to the minor grand trine, I think one of the things that jumped out at me about this solar eclipse chart is the kite formation, where you've got the Saturn Neptune opposition, which is obviously forming that minor grand trine, as you mentioned, with Uranus and Pluto, but the eclipse is forming an opposition with Saturn and Neptune. That's like the spine of the kite, and there's this kind of tension energy there, which I think is quite interesting. And as you said, it's like at the anaretic degree, so it sort of feels that's quite an intense formation. And SJ, what do you
Yeah,
think?
thank you. Yeah, for me, I like to do this with new and full moons sometimes to get an additional layer of meaning. And I think it adds to the idea of Virgo being the location of this solar eclipse. But use a derived chart, put the location of the moon, whether it's new or full, as the first house. And so in that chart, the domicile and exaltation lord is in the second house. We're back to material as a theme, materiality, material support. My sense is that by this time, and just to note, Venus is in Virgo now, Jupiter's in Cancer. Both benefics are either co-present or aspecting by sextile. This is a more supportive energy. I found the Pisces eclipse last time to be a little bit easier to grasp. I thought the edge was kind of taken off once that eclipse came to Pisces. Now, this can be different for different people, and we all experience this differently. But I think there's one case to be made with Jupiter's involvement and its aspects to both of these charts that this may be a little bit of a softer energy at one level and supportive for whatever kind of out of control stuff is going to happen. But let me just say, I think there's a combination here. And now you have the Virgo energy coming straight to head with Saturn and Pisces. And so if Saturn and Pisces is like a dream that is a little bit scary, like you have no idea what's happening, this dream, is it a dream? Is it not? It can be kind of surrealistic in a way that is uncomfortable, Saturn and Pisces. This to me feels like a moment where we may learn exactly how to ground and the needs we have in our material realms to help us here finish out the Saturn and Pisces foundations that have been laid, as you were saying earlier, Tara, for the last 2 years. I think this is a great opportunity of this second eclipse. It's like, okay, oh, this is the, feng shui that I need for my apartment to unlock the flow of energy. Oh no, this is the diet that I needed this ingredient to unlock my new, physical thriving so that I can kind of move into my hopes and dreams and really attack them. And so I'm looking for that kind of stuff, material focus What are the supports that we have, and how can those be rearranged here with this eclipse to help us meet the challenges of Saturn and Pisces and finish those out here for the next few months?
Yeah, no, I think all of that makes a lot of sense, especially around, I keep thinking of the word like restructuring. It's like we're trying to build from the bottom up, but by using previous kind of lessons. And as much as I think, oh, why does Saturn always have to be involved? I've been thinking about my personal journey in my eighth house. And I guess when we're talking abstractly, sometimes it can feel a bit nebulous, but when you bring it back to the personal and think about the natal chart, you can start to understand what we might be talking about. So I've been having lessons, eight house lessons, and me and my husband have the same rising, so we've had it doubly. And there's been things that Saturn has definitely taught us around shared finances because it's my eighth house. But I'm almost grateful for this retrograde and this 5 months back in Pisces because there was still things that need to be mopped up almost. And it feels like this eclipse is the beginning of that final kind of culmination. And so it makes sense that Saturn's a part of it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And Saturn's giving that kind of grounding. I think that was your word, SJ, which is, I think, really nice. That grounding energy in contrast to Pisces, but finding support there. And then the eclipse itself is almost a kind of in that late Earth degree kind of grounding influence as well. And just locally, and I don't know if this is the same where you both are, but something that jumped out at me is that the ascendant of this chart is in the late degrees of Taurus, and the MC is in the late degrees of Capricorn. So that almost feels like just a little hint of extra earthing.
Yeah, I'm with you too. And again, I go to one other thing about the new moon we just had. I think we're already into this. That's one thing I would just point out to folks out there. You're probably very much already into this eclipse story with what's happening in your Virgo sector, your Virgo whole sign house. So you might want to think about it if you're trying to prepare for this. Sometimes people get nervous about eclipses. And I would just encourage folks to think about this summer and then the house topics because Mars was there with the South Node in July. That was a little bit of a, a roller coaster. I'm sure you all talked about that on some of your shows. Mercury is not there yet, but the sun has been there since um, August 20th or whatever it is. So we've been engaging this area for a bit. And it may be that that can add, and we're about to engage it even deeper with Mercury's entry into Virgo, but that might help us prepare like, hey, yeah, this is the thing I've been working on. And so we can sort of get out ahead or protect that or give a little bit more energy to it or give it a break to let the eclipses do their thing without us trying to like force what that's trying to become. But I like when this happens because sometimes eclipses are like a brand new energy. It's like the first planet that's there, the sun will enter, and nothing has been there, and then there is an eclipse there. It's like wow, this is a radically different energy. But this eclipse is not that. This eclipse is a continuation and something we've already been well prepped for.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting the eclipse cycles, there's been a bit of an overlap. So we still had a bit of Aries when we moved into Virgo, Pisces, and and then before we move out of Virgo and Pisces, we're gonna get like a little taste of Aquarius, Leo. So it's almost like little precursors, but they're showing the overlap, and actually that's more realistic of what life is like. So I think you're right, SJ, in the sense that we're already feeling it, we're already in it, and it will just continue in that way. I did just want to talk quickly about nodal returns because obviously eclipses are based on the nodes, and if anyone has their nodes in Virgo and Pisces, then it's either your nodal return or your the reverse, which can feel even more potent because it's tied uniquely to your kind of karmic journey in a way. Do either of you have any kind of like nodal return stories? Like, where are your nodes? I don't think I know that. Where's yours, Helen? I've forgotten.
Mine are North Node in Gemini and the South Node in Sagittarius. So I'm thinking that's just late degrees mutable. Does that mean I'm having my nodal square at the moment or just
Sounds like it.
recently? Yeah, so that will be the square part of the whole 19-year cycle,
Cycle.
which probably means, some kind of culmination or a stage in whatever that journey has been about um, approximately 4 years ago, 4.5 years ago. And actually, that was just that was the event in my life around that time that led to me studying astrology, and roughly, in that time frame. So it's maybe the square is that, and even just talking about the square on a podcast with you both is actually a nice way to mark that point in this journey.
Yeah, and it's interesting because during my nodal return is when I discovered astrology. So I discovered astrology early 2018 when the nodes were in Leo and Aquarius. So I have a north node in Leo and my south node is in Aquarius at 1 degree. So Pluto is right there doing its thing. But yeah, it's always interesting to go back and look when the nodes return or when it squares or reverses because there tends to be kind of pivotal things. Like I moved away from home to start university. I went overseas in my first nodal return, and both times I learned about who I was fundamentally because it's in the first and seventh house. So it is interesting when you start to see those cycles. So what about you, SJ? Where's your nodes?
Yeah, same as signs as yours. We're born in the same year,
Oh
and mine,
yeah.
yeah, mine are. But my, it might not be that we're in the same sign, but I happen to
Yeah.
be a Leo Aquarius as well, and yeah, the nodal returns are huge. I mean, they're major. I've talked about it before as the fated transit of fated transits. So you have the basket of fated transits every nodal transit, but this is the one that's the higher level of like of that domain. This is the fated transit that you would pick out of all of those other fated transits. And it's really where the life can show itself, the true nature of why we're here. I've seen it over and over again. I've lived it. My nodal return in 2018, as you laid out, I think so, it was some in 2017. There was eclipses in Leo, 2018, and then there probably was a straggler in 2019. I can't remember, but yeah, that's when I was already a serious astrology student. But that's when I left the job I had had for many years and left America. I mean, that's how big it was for me. I mean, I
Wow.
left my hometown and I became an expat, and I, I started publishing publicly about astrology on Astro Twitter, so that which ended up becoming a linchpin for my professional development into the career that I have now, which is a professional astrologer. So it was a pivotal moment of me becoming
Wow.
who I am. And I talk about, so we share that, Helen, that it brought all of us, it brought us deeper into astrology in a certain way. And I think, I don't know how you two think about it. I'm guessing this is the case for you, just having heard you talk here today. But, astrology wasn't something I even set out to be or know about, or it wasn't, I mean, of course we all know about it. But, read a horoscope in my little local newspaper occasionally, but I wasn't like ambitious around this craft or wasn't even really aware that this craft existed and the depth of it and the detailed nature of it. And for me, the events that brought me into astrology were not my nodal return, but they were just before. But, as someone was saying earlier here, life's a flow. I mean, nothing is going to be exactly when there's a sign change and then everything begins. It's always a flow, a rise and a fall and an overlap. But I do think that it's part of my fate to be an astrologer. It certainly felt that way. And in 2018, I was at UAC. I met a lot of astrologers that I had professional relationships with later. And it's in my 11th house, Leo. So all of that, the true fate of my professional networking emerged there during that time, going to UAC in 2018, summer 2018. That was part of the nodal emergences for me. And I wasn't even that keyed into this stuff back then. I mean, I was a serious student, but I wasn't like, hey, these are eclipses in my 11th house. I'm looking, I wasn't quite as keyed into the nodes back then, but looking back, it becomes very clear. But yeah, it's a beautiful time. So if anybody's got a nodal inversion or an eclipses in the mutable axis, and that's where your nodes are, just look out for, this is what I tell people in readings, that you want to find a sensation where like, oh, epiphany, like that's why I'm here. Yeah, it all makes sense. It locks in. I've sometimes looked, I use the metaphor where it's like you have gears, and when gears start moving and there's a match, things just work, right? And so it's this idea of that feeling is what I think the nodal returns can bring, of like a sense of this is why all of those years that came before this, okay, now it's so clear. This is what I've been, it was like the set pieces for this moment. And these things that start emerging where you feel that sense of confirmation is what I would encourage people to be open to experiencing during a nodal return.
No, I really enjoyed hearing both your stories and all the overlaps. And it's always great when you look back, like once you find astrology and you start getting excited about all the different rabbit holes, and then you start looking back when you weren't into astrology and it's all there loud and clear. And I love that. That's like one of my favorite parts is just still finding and discovering things when I wasn't even aware of it, that it was working whether you're aware of it or not, that it will continue to do that. And I think the nodals stories are a perfect example of that, where you didn't even know what was happening to you till it was happening. And then here we are, how many years
Yeah.
later on a podcast talking about astrology. So what's really interesting as well is just looking at whether you were born, either of you born near an eclipse, because Chris Brennan does a really good podcast around that and how it shows up in progressions, which is something me and Helen have touched on before in our episodes because we really like this technique. And it's and I might not be as good as explaining it as you, Helen, but it's essentially for the first 30 days of your life represents the first 30 years of life. So the first 3 months is essentially 90 days and 90 years. And what you can see in those first 3 months is essentially a map of your life. And it's really quite interesting when you start looking at that on a progressed level. So for me, I was born about 10 days after an eclipse. Which still makes me, because my nose about 1 degree. So I think I still kind of carry that energy. But what it means is I don't have one in my progressions. But I think you said, Helen, that you feel you're going to get one later on in yours.
Yeah, that's right. I picked that up that I will have my next progressed new moon, which is in around 30 years, will be an eclipse that took place, a large number of days after I was born. And so we talked about fate as being almost an inescapable quality of the nodes and the moon. And I think an eclipse by progression will certainly be an interesting turn of events, but I'll have to wait some time to see what it will actually show up as.
Yeah.
Were you SJ born close to an eclipse?
I wasn't. So my nodes are in the fifth and 11th house axis, and then my sun is in two signs away. So I actually would have, it's kind of the perfect birth for no eclipse in my progress chart unless this life extension stuff comes through. But no, I won't experience an eclipse, and I wasn't born near one. But I will say I feel really sensitive to them. I mean, every eclipse season, I don't know about you two, but like this last week, things got really strange. And we were
Yeah.
talking about this earlier, but I time eclipse season one way to do it. I don't like just like the standard 1 week before, 1 week after that some astrologers have used. I think we have better timing than that using the zodiac. The sun enters the sign where it will eclipse or be eclipsed. There you go. You have a real solar energetic shift, and that will tell you when an eclipse season. That's one way to define it, and that I like. But for me, this last couple of weeks, as soon as that sun got to Virgo, I started feeling heavy eclipse activation, and just things have been not going like I planned, and it just feels weird and strange, and all kinds of little errors, and just like our scheduling here. We
Mm.
tried to schedule, and we had to just move it a few days, but stuff like that has been kind of in every area of my life, and all I can do is just say, all right, well, I'm just along for the ride, suit up and show up and trust that it's for the best, right? Today I'm not pressed for time, so we've had a little bit more of a relaxed,
Yeah.
I think, with the time compression. So maybe that was part of why we needed to do this today versus another day where we would have to truncate or we wouldn't get to talk about as much as we've gotten to talk about today. But what I was going to say is, I mean, I do think when you are an eclipse baby, so born near an eclipse or in between eclipses, there is maybe an imperative to always map them because they may tell those stories of your life unfoldment quite precisely. I've seen that with clients, but I do think all of us are can be exposed to this intensity no matter where the nodes are in our chart. I mean, we all have the nodes in the chart. We all have them somewhere, and we have the rulers of the nodes in our chart somewhere. And you know, so yeah. Anyhow, just a few more thoughts on that. And let me say this earlier because someone was, I think one of you said, just these are essential. The nodes and eclipses are not separate from life. This is one thing I really want to make clear. Not that people were thinking otherwise, but this is part of the totality of life. I mean, eclipses and nodes, moments where there's high strange and weird occurrences that are unlike most of the other time. That, yes, it's anomalous when you look at it that way, but it's also part of the whole, meaning that life needs to include these pockets of time where things have to be rearranged against our better judgment. And I tell, or against our expected judgment. And I tell people a lot like, hey, I think about it from my own life. I need help. If it was up to me, I would stay in my little prison, And eclipses, I think sometimes I like to view it as like God helping me break free from things that I can't really do on my own because I'm just a fallible human, And so that's a good, at least for me, has helped. It's like, okay, I need some help, or I'm willing, have mercy on me. I don't want it to be too hard, but yeah, if you have to like take something from my life and give me a little bit of an unexpected curveball here because it's going to help me in the long term, like, okay, I consent to that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it. And my relationship with fate has changed so much since becoming an astrologer and actually just leaning into it and accepting it and just going with the flow, even though it sounds more difficult than it is or easier than it is, it's necessary. And actually, since leaning into that idea of it's there to help and you can only grow through challenges and pressures and direct kind of, I don't know, confrontation, like being confronted with things and just saying, okay, but it's for the better good. And I think having that approach like you, SJ, does help, especially knowing, like going back to what Ruji said about cycles, it's just very comforting to know that it's a cycle. There's a beginning, there's an end, it will come back and it will, having that almost feels like something that's constant, even though it's constant change. It'd be great to hear some like lived experiences of eclipses. And Helen, you said you had quite a fascinating family example. Do you want to tell us about it?
So this is a member of my family who was born 3 days before a solar eclipse and married someone who was born 3 days after a lunar eclipse. And this is they're completely different years, completely different signs. And I didn't pick this up until after their son was born 3 days after a solar eclipse. So it almost was like a perfect combination of the characteristics of the parents' eclipse in 3 days of a distance in all cases. So there's this sense in which I think it will be worth looking out for eclipse seasons in his life, certainly. And the other thing that struck me about that, and we've talked a lot about that kind of fated element of when the sun and the moon come together, and the sun gives this sense of linearity and we're going out in a direction in our life, and progress chart reflects that as well. But then the moon throws curveballs along the way, and that's part of it too, and that's part of the cycle. So when he was born, I thought it feels like they were meant to get together, and he was meant to be their son and be born when he was. It almost feels like you feel so certain about that. I don't know how either of you would, when you were interpreting that as a professional astrologer, what would go through your mind?
I was going to just say on that, it's a perfect example of what I was saying earlier about when someone's born near an eclipse, you want to encourage them to like get an eclipse calendar up and say, hey, events in your life may emerge here around eclipses because that's of the nature of you. And so that they both were eclipse babies, and then having a child is a huge life event.
Mhm.
So it just that would be a evidence of that technique working. Eclipses are going to time important events. So yeah, but other than that, there's a lot. We tend to you see it in synastry a lot, like similar modalities, similar elements, similar like everybody in the family is a mutable rising. I see that, or everybody's got the same sun, similar suns and moons and rising affinity. So it makes me think that eclipses should be included in that analysis too. People near eclipses converging with each other.
Yeah, and also just the way in which our natal nodes, if they touch certain points in synastry, it definitely feels that karmic resonance. So my husband's moon is conjunct my north node, and his north node is conjunct my IC. And just, I won't bore you all with how we met, but it all just feels incredibly, incredibly fated. And so whenever I do readings, it's one of the first things I'll pull up just because I've seen it in lived examples of how it can just show these connections. And when I think about the astrology of family dynamics and that invisible thread that you see, and not even just within family members, but just even between us three, like our karmic journey with each other and how we, meet people. I think, Helen, your example, that family example, is a perfect example of how the nodes can really show up so loudly. At the moment, there's like quite a bit of, I won't go into detail, but we're having a family stuff going on, and there's 6 different members of the family, all connected by this Virgo-Pisces axis. 4 of them have their natal nodes there, and there's this whole thing that's blowing up where I'm getting dragged in because my Venus is there, and it's someone else's story, and it's just how you kind of get pulled into all these other webs of karma and fate. And I think it's incredibly interesting when we start to delve into like the family dynamics of all of this.
Completely. And I think that's wise advice, Tara, for any transit, that understanding it may be other people that, and their challenges, uh, that is what the transit in your chart is speaking to. So, for example, like a fifth house transit, maybe it's your children and their schooling, or there's something that they're going through, like with Saturn in the fifth, for example, for Scorpio risings right now. Maybe they're doing fine, but their son is in college and struggling with their major and just challenges there. And I think with eclipses, I've seen that often because it's a time when people can tend to go like full moons. There's just energy where some people, if they're not equipped or grounded, or and not to blame people or to talk down about people, but I mean, I've been crazy in my life when I was younger and didn't have the tools I have now to live well. And not everybody is equipped to live well. They don't have, mental, emotional, spiritual tools to get through challenging emotional or turbulence emotionally. And there's blowback and spillover from that. And so I think it is wise to just be aware that people may be blowing up around us, so-called, during these times of intensity. And it's helped me a lot to know, all right, this is just like Mercury stationing retrograde, and this person's freaking out. And, I can kind of not get as dragged in or choose to participate carefully, because sometimes we can't avoid participation if it's like people we're obligated to engage with. But yeah, it's wise to, it's helped me to navigate life knowing that these transits are happening to everybody else at the same time they're happening to me, and it can explain things.
And we could talk all day about the extent to which the charts, in sort of 20th century modern psychological astrology was seen as the entire psyche of the person, and anything out with that was projection. And I've never really accepted that, because I think that can be the case, but also charts interact with each other. It's dynamic, and we kind of bounce off each other. I think that just really highlights something around how transits can be both inner processes and outer events, and also what's happening in the lives of other people, especially in particular houses. And I wonder, we're just coming up to the end of our time here, so I just wonder if, SJ, would you like to offer any closing thoughts around eclipses in general and the Virgo-Pisces dynamic?
Absolutely. Yeah. I just want to say, I'm glad to be with you too. Thanks for having me today and to be talking about eclipses. And for me, I just want to encourage people, that eclipses are part of you. They're part of the so-called circle of life, to use that Elton John lyric. You two are in there in the UK, but I mean, there's a reason for eclipses. There's a reason for eclipse season. This is not some anomalous thing we need to be afraid of. It's actually a necessary part of our life and the unfoldment of our lives. And so eclipses can very often propel us into what we're here to do, and what the fate of our beingness is, at this time. And And so getting excited, particularly about an eclipse season where you have Jupiter doing so much heavy lifting, hitting by trine the first eclipse and by sextile the second eclipse, I think for a lot of us, we can be brought in here to, the beauty of our trajectories. So, staying optimistic, staying hopeful, and, that to me is kind of the best card to play at one level. And on the other level, I think, I would advise people, if you can, tend to that inner world. Whenever eclipses happen in the Vedic systems, they say, don't even go outside, right? Only pray and meditate and don't go outside. I think it's wise to maybe turn down when you can and maybe tend to your inner landscape, especially when there is such a water element heavy fall period. And for both eclipses, the water element is a major component. The first one in a Pisces with Saturn and Pisces, the second one pretty closely opposite Saturn and Pisces. So there might be a way to do this where the inner life and tending to our inner world as a kind of primary, goal for particularly here in September, but really for the rest of the fall, can help guide you here. What do you need? How do you feel? Try to write that down. Like, I'm feeling this way. I'm happy. This makes me happy. Like trying to be in with that inner landscape, and even putting music on, things that can engender emotion, the emotional body, and help you have comfort with that emotional body. I think are all things that we can do here. And just one final point: Mars does enter Scorpio the day after that second eclipse. And so I think we're going to need this kind of depth of emotional processing in some ways to set us up to get into a little bit more of an active phase here, September, October, and into early November, where the lessons that this eclipse season will bring, we're going to get to apply those here with some really strong Mars support right away. So anyhow, just wishing everybody the best eclipse season, wishing you too the best eclipse season that we can possibly have. And, cheers to fate, cheers to being alive, and, to having eclipses to help us. We need them. We need them to help us, to take things away that aren't serving us. So
No, thank you, SJ. That's such wise words, and I really appreciate all of your insights today. It's been a pleasure conversing with both of you, and I think you have made a really good point about Scorpio and Mars, and we've not had anything really supportive in Mars since before the Mars retrograde. So there's all of that going on as well. So yeah, I think this is a time to rest, restart, reset, look within and slow down as we approach this autumn equinox. So thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to Lunar Reflections. My name's Tara.
And I'm
And
Helen, and just to echo that, thanks again, SJ. It's been great to have you here. Really, loads of insight and lots to think about there, and a really positive, encouraging note for us all going into eclipse season.